Bellundur was a small village in an area that was, at that time, heavily populated by tigers, which in turn kept the leopard population almost non-existent due to competition for prey and territory. The region surrounding Bellundur was home to a menagerie of common wildlife species such as cheetal or axis deer, sandbar deer, Indian wild boar, monkeys, peafowl, hyenas, sloth bears, and of course, Bengal tigers. Elephants were more rare in this area than the leopards, not roaming the wilds of this region at all at the time, although they could be found being used as military animals or beasts of burden. This is a stark contrast to the densely populated tech mecca that Bellundur is today in 2026. At the time of this tale, the exact year unknown, Bellundur was a rural farming village surrounded by dense woodlands and agricultural fields. The British colonial government encouraged cattle rearing in this region as it had suitable grazing pasture to sustain cows for the growing cattle market. As the cattle flourished, native deer and wild boar populations, which were natural prey for the tigers, became fragmented by encroaching farmland and herds of cattle. Our story today is centered around one tiger, a female tiger that grew up like most tigers do, reared by her mother and taught to hunt and kill her own prey until she becomes fully independent around 20 months old, when she is then driven away by her mother to find her own territory and mates. As she grew and became stronger, she took on larger and larger prey. From the quick cheetal to the robust boar and sandbar, she mastered her craft of stalking and killing. But her prey were as equally adapted to avoid being killed as she was at killing. About 9 out of 10 times, the deer or boar were too quick. The wind would betray her scent, or the birds and monkeys foiled her hunt with their alarm calls. The tiger had grown into a fine specimen over the years. Several 100 pounds of spring-loaded muscle wrapped in a uniquely striped coat. Her hide was marked with the scars of a life spent hunting and surviving in the unforgiving jungle. She had grown into a formidable predator, controlling her range with tooth and claw and hunting all she could catch. She was the dominant tigress in her territory and had to let any interloping young females or prospective new mates know it. As she patrolled her range, she marked her boundaries with her scent and would occasionally broadcast her presence with roars that sent shockwaves through the jungle. On one such patrol, she caught the scent of something new on the wind. It was rich and earthy, like the smell of boar dung, only sweeter. The smell was heavy on the air and close. The tiger investigated. As she approached from downwind, the smell grew stronger. Then her ears locked onto the sounds coming from the direction that the scent was leading her. She could hear low bellows that reminded her of the guttural calls of the forest bison, or gaur, of which there weren't many in these woods, but she had once pounced onto the back of an old bull when she was a younger tiger. It bucked her off and trotted off into the jungle, snorting defiantly with its curled horns held high. But she was a far larger and stronger tiger today, and these weren't gaur. They were domestic cattle. They grazed on native forage lazily, while their tails and floppy ears slapped at pestering flies, and their loose, wrinkly skin clung to their stout frames like a wet towel. Their mostly white hide shone brightly in the mid-morning sun. The tiger hadn't fed in days, and her instinct to kill took over as she melted to the ground and slithered toward the herd. How such a large and heavy predator moved so silently was a wonder. The alarm system of the jungle, in the form of birds and monkeys, had no allegiance with man's cattle. No one warned the herd as the huge cat crept within striking distance. The tiger was tense and ready to spring. Her pupils dilated. Every whisker stood on end. She salivated in anticipation. In the blink of an eye, she erupted from cover, only 2 bounds away from the nearest cow. She leapt onto its back, and her claws ripped into its loose hide. The tiger was nearly the same size as the cow, and her weight made the cow's legs buckle, and it folded to the ground in a cloud of dust. As fluid as a drop of rain off a leaf, the big tiger rolled around to the cow's throat and sank her 4-inch fangs into its windpipe. The cow gurgled and bellowed as it kicked its death throes. The tiger held it down until it was sufficiently dead. Then she rose and nearly effortlessly dragged the dead weight with her teeth into the dense underbrush where she could consume it in peace. The rest of the cattle fled in a panic, and they returned to their herdsmen with one less in their number. The herdsmen took note of this, but they would in time become painfully aware of this cattle thievery as the tiger mastered the process of killing their cows. She killed one after the other, and the tiger was soon dining on prime beef for every meal. It was too easy for her. She killed calf and bull alike, whatever was easiest to catch at the moment. One night, the tiger heard a calf bawling for its mother and keenly investigated. In the moonlight, she could clearly see a young cow with her nocturnal eyes. It stood against a thick briar patch that blocked it from fleeing in any direction except toward the tiger. As if the calf wasn't easy enough to catch, there would be no escape for the helpless thing. The tiger crept forward, then began to bound forward in a charge. The calf wriggled and panicked as it saw the giant cat closing in. The tiger could already anticipate the feeling of the calf's neck vertebrae snapping in her jaws as she squeezed the breath from its windpipe. But suddenly the ground gave way beneath the tiger's paws, and she plummeted into a deep dark hole with a thud, immediately followed by an enraged roar. She was trapped. The villagers of Bellundur had captured their cattle thief. This tiger hadn't only killed a few cows here and there. If that had been the case, the villagers could have endured their losses as divine trials and not have intervened in the tiger's cattle killing. However, this tiger was no petty thief. She had slaughtered multiple herds by the time the normally patient people of Bellundur decided to end her killing spree. The next morning there was a great commotion in the village. The tiger pit was caved in. Now, the people of Bellundur owned no guns, and only 2 of them owned spears. However, both spears had been rendered as dull as a crowbar after years of being used as crude digging tools for farming. The tiger had resigned herself to resting in the shade of the pit after several failed attempts at escaping. She began to hear the chattering of man approaching from above. She flattened her ears and whipped her tail in frustration as she glared up at the sky from her earthen jail cell. As the people crowded around the entrapped beast, they began to torment her by throwing rocks and firebrands at her. She roared defiantly as they marred and singed her hide. The 2 villagers armed with spears planned to skewer her to the bottom of the pit and end her thieving days forever. But their weapons of execution were woefully inadequate. The first spear bounced off the tiger's body with a dull thud, answered by a roar in anger. The second spear pierced the tiger's flank, then all hell broke loose. With an ear-splitting roar, the enraged tiger leapt for the rim of the pit and found purchase with her claws, and began furiously scrambling with her hind legs as she clawed and heaved her way towards her tormentors. The now unarmed villagers panicked and began to scatter. In an instant, the tiger was free. It sprang from the pit like a, quote, demon from hell, and far more dangerous. It happened so fast that some villagers scarcely had time to flee. One unlucky man stood directly in the warpath of the tormented tiger. The giant cat leapt over him and used the man's head as a springboard, scalping him with its hind claws in the process. The tiger then disappeared into the jungle. The man that was scalped would die of his infected wounds only 3 days later. Though not intentionally, the tiger had claimed its first human life. More baits and traps were set for the tiger, but she was wise to these tricks now. She ignored their traps and more brazenly robbed the villagers of their cattle. She would attack in broad daylight, and no one could predict her next arrival. When the herdsmen would try to drive her off in defense of their livestock, she would set upon them with thunderous roars, and even caught one man and mauled him. Miraculously, this man was spared death and would recover from his wounds. The villagers were forced to keep their cattle at home and would no longer graze them in the forests, making beef harder to acquire for the tiger around Bellundur. So the tiger extended her hunting grounds to nearby villages in her range, continuing to kill cattle until the infamy of her deeds had spread across the land. Soon thereafter, a railway officer who was recently transferred to the area heard of this dreaded cattle killer. The officer, only known to us as Mr. Johnson, was from a part of India that had no tigers, and he fancied the idea of slaying the beast himself. So he made his way to Bellundur to gather more information on the monster. The village had a resident necromancer named Budaya, a thin, scraggly old wizard with an unkempt white beard and shabby garb. Old Budaya was known by the villagers for his magical abilities, which apparently ranged from making someone fall in or out of love with you, to arresting the jungle in a spell that guaranteed the success of a hunter. When Mr. Johnson arrived in Bellundur, he was quickly approached by old Budaya, who offered to bless the White Hunter's mission with sure success in exchange for a few rupees. Johnson brushed off the old man, and when Budaya persisted, Johnson lost his temper with him and threatened to wring his neck if he didn't stop pestering him. Johnson's behavior not only angered the village wizard, but the rest of the village as well. No one would barter or deal with the newcomer, and all refused to help him on his mission to bait and hunt the tiger. Johnson went to the neighboring village of Dhaka and bought 2 old bulls to be used as tiger bait. The following morning, when Johnson checked his baits, he found one of the bulls missing, but no tiger pug marks were to be found. Instead, he found man tracks in the sand. The villagers of Bellundur had surely stolen it, he concluded. Johnson stormed into Bellundur, brandishing his rifle, threatening the people while demanding that they return his bull. His threats were ignored, and the people claimed to know nothing of his missing bull. Not wishing to earn jail time for murder, Johnson left the village in a rage and resigned himself to his one remaining bait. Johnson returned to Takarthi and paid the 2 men that he bought the bulls from to construct him a machan over the remaining bait bull. He sat in it that evening and stood guard for a cattle thief, be it tiger or man. To his utter shock, the sun did not get a chance to set before the tiger made an appearance. The shaken man put a bead on the striped beast as it launched an attack on the tethered bull. Johnson had never beheld a wild tiger before, let alone shot one. As he perspired and his nerves caused him to tremble, he attempted to hold his aim on the great cat. He pulled the trigger. The tiger roared in pain and fled into the jungle, venting her fury as she fled deep into the trees. She was hit, but it wasn't fatal. Johnson would search the surrounding jungle for a week, but he would find no sign of the tiger. The villagers refused to help him in his search, and when he gave up the hunt and left, it seemed as though the tiger had left too. Perhaps the villagers had to admit he may have solved their tiger problem after all. For the rest of the story, the account that follows comes from one of India's most well-known hunter-naturalists, Kenneth Anderson. Anderson spent much of his life in the forests of southern India, documenting wildlife and the people who lived alongside it.
So the cattle were driven out into the jungles once again each day for grazing. That is, until the inevitable happened. Early one afternoon, a herd rushed pell-mell back into the village, minus one of its members, and minus the 19-year-old youth who had gone out with the animals that morning to graze them. Nobody worried about the matter till nightfall. Then the relatives of the boy grew a little anxious about him, while the owner of the missing cow grew far more anxious about his valuable animal. A search the next morning revealed the cow laying dead. Her neck had been neatly broken by a large tiger, whose pug marks were clearly to be seen in the field where she had been struck down. 100 yards away, hidden under a bush, was the body of the missing youth. There was, however, this difference between the 2 carcasses. The cow had not been eaten, while rather more than half of the youth's body had been devoured by the tiger. The familiar pattern had appeared once more. An innocent tiger had been turned into a man-eater through being wounded and left to fend for itself. Tragedy succeeded tragedy after that, and the pattern of events was repeated. The people of Bellundur locked themselves in their huts at sundown, while the cattle were kept starving in their pens. Lack of human prey drove the tiger to extending his operations towards Takarthi and more distant villages, and that was when the beast began to be referred to as the ogre. A name that was whispered with bated breath, behind locked doors, and only during daylight hours. Otherwise it would surely hear and bring dreadful vengeance upon the man who dared refer to the creature as a tiger. After darkness the ogre was about. It roamed everywhere, and a man was not safe, even in a locked room. The ogre, or one of its spies, an evil spirit of the air in the form of a bat or an owl, or one of the many devils that lived in the jungle, might hear what was being said, and carry words to the dreaded man-eater. Then the man who had spoken against it was indeed undone. It would only be a matter of time before the ogre exacted a terrible revenge. His fate was sealed, and there was no means of escape. That was the universal opinion. At this stage, my old friend, Dr. Stanley, the medical officer of Takarthi village, wrote a long letter to me and related this story, inviting me to join him in an attempt to end the ogre's career. I met him 3 days later in the front room of his dispensary-cum-hospital after motoring to Takarthi in my Studebaker. The first thing he insisted upon was a tremendous meal, with gallons of tea, after which, over clouds of pipe smoke, we discussed old times for about 3 hours. Generally long-suffering by nature, at times I became impatient. Finally, I reminded the good doctor that there was a job of work to be done. Obviously, the first step was to visit Bellundur and pick up the trail from there. The Studebaker had a hard time to reach this village. The track, which was always bad, had become really terrible after the last rains. The doctor who sat next to me said we should have walked. Having reached Bellundur at last, I set about undoing, as far as possible, some of the mischief that had been done by the tactless Johnson. I called upon Bediah, who was sulking in his hut, asked him to don his ceremonial robes and make a puja for me, and repeat all the mantras he knew to enable me to succeed in shooting the man-eater, presenting him with 10 rupees to cover incidental expenses. He brightened up at once. In no time at all, he stalked out of the marketplace, all dressed up for the occasion, where the first thing he did was to demand another 5 rupees from me to cover the cost of a black fowl and a bottle of local spirit called arak. The fowl was to be killed, cooked, and eaten by him, presumably to placate the spirits of the jungle. And the arak was to be drunk, also by Bediah, presumably for the same purpose. The old man declared that only thereafter would he be in proper condition to utter the mantras that would lead to the downfall of the man-eater. Dr. Stanley and I, knowing what state that would be, pretended hearty agreement. I handed over the money and resigned myself to a further delay of another hour at least, which would be the shortest possible time for the cock to be half-cooked while Bediah had conditioned himself with arak for saying his mantras. But the old man, and the villagers of Bellundur especially, had to be humored if the damage done by Johnson was to be repaired. The doctor and I chatted while the unfortunate black cock was procured, slaughtered before our eyes, parboiled into a curry, then devoured by the greedy old necromancer. With scarcely an interval, he proceeded to empty the bottle of arak by the simple process of applying the neck to his mouth and pouring the contents down his throat. Why he did not choke in the process amazed me. This done, the magician staggered to his feet. He was dead drunk and could hardly stand erect. With bloodshot eyes and an inane smile, he produced what looked like a bracelet of twisted and dried jungle vines from a filthy cloth bag he brought out of somewhere on his person. Asking for my rifle, he proceeded to pass this bracelet over the end of the muzzle and down the length of the barrel 3 or 4 times. He was so drunk that he missed his aim once or twice. But I was able to rectify the error unostentatiously by quickly guiding the end of the barrel so as to allow it to be encircled by the bracelet. That was the end of the mantra. The tiger's doom was sealed. It would fall to my rifle. The spirits of the jungle, in the person of old Bediah, had eaten and drunk well. The crowd of villagers who had been watching every detail while they stood around us in a circle breathed this assurance loudly. In any case, the mantra, together with their assurances, ended just in time, for the next moment old Bediah fell onto the earth, as if poleaxed. The important thing was that good feeling had been restored. Bediah's prestige was up again, as was that of the villagers and of Bellundur village itself. Dr. Stanley and I were smiled upon as good fellows, while the activities of the ogre were momentarily eclipsed. Just then it was no more than an ordinary tiger, waiting to be shot. It was now dark, and the trip back to Takarthi in the Studebaker was a nightmare. We made it, however, without any broken axles or springs, but resolved that henceforth we would walk there and back rather than risk a breakdown, which would be inevitable if we tempted fate too much. Stanley procured 2 baits at Takarthi, which we duly tied out the next day at suitable points near the track to Bellundur. For you will remember that I told you that the tiger was by this time operating throughout the area. After lunch we walked the 7 miles to that village, and we were able there, without any difficulty, to procure another 3 animals as additional baits. Obviously the little show we had organized with Bediah the previous evening had had its good effects. These baits were tied out at points which the villagers informed us were often visited by the ogre. Time was against us, however, and we were in too much of a hurry to be able to set up a machan above any of the 5 baits we had laid that day. This is against my usual practice of constructing a machan first and tying the bait in full view of it afterwards, which has 2 advantages. Firstly, a kill, if it occurs, is in the proper view of the machan and does not have to be shifted. Secondly, no noise is made in the building of the machan, which would be inevitable if the kill occurs first. Such sounds may arouse a suspicion of the tiger if it is laying up or otherwise lurking within hearing. It was again pitch dark when we walked back to Takarthi, keeping a sharp lookout with our torches against a surprise attack by the man-eater. But the only animal we encountered was a pangolin, foraging among the dead leaves, out much earlier than usual for these creatures. None of the baits we had tied out was touched that night. But late in the morning of the 3rd day, a man came running to the doctor's dispensary to announce that his cousin had been taken by the tiger. The victim and his wife, together with our informant and his wife, lived in 2 huts constructed side by side and only a short mile away along the track to Bellundur. The sun was at meridian when this cousin, who was returning from a visit to Takarthi for provisions, came into full view of the other 3 members of the little community, gathered before their huts and were chatting together. They had been about to call to him when he had screamed loudly and then vanished into thin air. Our informant stated he had then grabbed his axe and set out to see what was the matter, accompanied by his cousin's wife, wringing her hands and lamenting aloud. The thought of the man-eater had never occurred to them. Rather, they suspected that an evil spirit from the forest had done away with their companion. Reaching the spot where the man had disappeared, they were terrified to find the pug marks of a tiger in the soft sand of the trail. Prevented by fear from going farther, they were about to turn back when the wails of the woman, which had now increased in volume, annoyed the man-eater, who had just begun to taste his victim not far away. The tiger growled fiercely, whereupon both man and the victim's wife fled. Stopping long enough to enable the 2 women to lock themselves into one of the huts, the man had come running to Takarthi by a roundabout route to inform the doctor and me of what had happened. The ogre would be there still, he affirmed, feasting upon his cousin, if only we had the courage to come at once and shoot it. Grabbing rifle, torch, and warm coat, I set out at a jog trot with our informant, Stanley bringing with him the 12-bore gun and another torch. I was younger in those days than I am now, and the doctor younger still, so that we reached the 2 huts in fairly good shape, if a bit breathless. Minutes later, with the man in the middle, Stanley to the left of him and me to the right, we approached the place where the tragedy had taken place, determined to flush the man-eater on its kill. The tiger sensed we were coming long before we knew where it was, for we heard no sounds of eating or the breaking of bones. As likely as not had seen our arrival at the 2 huts, which were, as I have said, in full view of the spot where the ogre had seized its victim. When we were quite close, the man-eater began to growl, and its protest grew to hideous volume. Clearly, it was bent on driving us away. If we beat retreat now, While the going was good, all would be well. But if we continued to advance, it would either rush us, or its courage might fail at the last moment, and it would run away. We hesitated only a second before Stanley and I nodded to each other. With my left arm, I thrust back the man who had called us, motioning him with my hand to go away. Then we advanced, shoulder to shoulder. We could not see the tiger yet. Roar followed upon roar, and the bushes in front of us shook violently. We stopped, gun and rifle to respective shoulders, awaiting the onslaught that was inevitable. It never came. At the last moment, the man-eater shirked the encounter. It was accustomed to chasing and killing men. Never before had human beings deliberately followed and approached it. With a final shattering roar, the tiger sprang away from the spot, and I was just able to catch a fleeting glimpse of a reddish-brown form hurtling into a bush. Then it disappeared. I could have fired. Why I did not do so, I cannot say, but I was to regret my mistake. The tiger must have been really hungry, for we discovered it had made the most of its opportunity by devouring over half of its victim, leaving only the head, arms, legs, and a few ribs uneaten. Stanley and I did not speak to each other. We were both experienced enough to know that the human voice carries a long way. Instead, I looked about to see if there were any possible places to conceal myself and await the man-eater's return, should it decide to come back to finish what scraps were left. But the ogre put an end to my reflections by its next action, as unexpected as it was sudden. It might have been hunger, or natural ill nature, or maybe the fact that as it fled it saw only two humans and not a crowd had dared to follow. Anyway, this extraordinary animal stopped in its tracks, turned about, and started to come for us, roaring louder as it approached. The ground literally shook with the intensity of the sound, while its ever-increasing volume indicated that the tiger was getting dangerously close. You must bear in mind that all this time we could not see the beast, for it was hidden by the bushes. What we could see was the bushes shaking violently as it came closer and closer. What was happening just goes to indicate the axiom I have so often repeated in my earlier stories. There are no fixed rules in the jungle, and no two animals are alike. Like us, they are individuals. They react differently under different circumstances, and the unexpected often occurs. Standing shoulder to shoulder once more, the doctor and I turned to face the man-eater, which was making things easy for us and solving the problem by attacking. In another minute, the tiger would have to show itself, and then all would be over. But the minute never came, for the ogre was wily beyond expectation. At the last moment, it changed its mind once more, and began to circle us and the remains of its meal without showing itself, still snarling and roaring for all it was worth. The animal's tactics were now clear. Again, its courage failed when it had been about to press home its attack. Now its intention was to drive us away with the noise it was making. Then I had an idea. Its success depended on just how observant the tiger had been, how persistent was its memory, and how alert its instinct. It had seen the two of us approaching. That much was evident. Now, if one of us went away, and the other hid in the grass somewhere near the remains of the victim, would the tiger be aware of the fact? Would it think the coast was clear and return to its meal? Would it be tempted to follow and attack the one who was retreating? Would it see through the trick we were trying to play by stalking whichever one of us had remained behind and leaping upon that one from the rear? There were too many imponderables in the situation, and I confess I did not like them at all. Moreover, the doctor was armed only with a shotgun. If I suggested that he should go back and leave me behind, it was possible the tiger might decide to stalk him, when Stanley would be at a decided disadvantage. Alternatively, if I left the doctor behind and walked away myself, and the man-eater decided to attack him instead of me, the same disadvantage would be there. As a last resource, I could offer the doctor my rifle and take his gun. Frankly, I did not relish that last solution. I was accustomed to my .405 in emergencies. No doubt Stanley had the same feelings for his shotgun. If we exchanged weapons, we would both be unfamiliar with the firearm each of us was handling, and the shotgun, moreover, was hardly suitable for a meeting with a man-eater. Evidently, These very thoughts were passing through Stanley's mind as he solved the problem for me by whispering to me to hide while he would go away. Without speaking, I thrust my rifle toward him and reached for his shotgun, but Stanley turned it away from me, motioning impatiently towards the bushes for me to hide. The tiger was creeping about now, circling our position and continuing to snarl and roar alternately. A single bush, not more than 4 feet high, grew about 30 feet or so away, its base hidden by the usual carpet of grass and greenery. There was no other large tree or rock that offered shelter. I tiptoed to the bush and took up my position behind it, crouching on the ground with my weapon ready. We waited till the tiger had reached a point that was opposite the direction in which the doctor would have to go to regain the track leading towards the 2 huts. Then I motioned to him to get away quickly, with the purpose of letting the man-eater know that he was departing and that the coast would be clear to return to the meal. Stanley coughed slightly and began to talk to himself as he began to back slowly toward the track. I watched him looking intently in the direction where the man-eater was still demonstrating his 12-bore gun ready for action should the animal charge. But Stanley had made a mistake by talking. Instead of returning to its kill now that the coast was clear as the doctor had hoped, this most unusual animal did the unexpected thing once again. Circling the scant clearing in which the remains of the victim reposed, and incidentally myself, the tiger began to follow the departing doctor. Worse still, it stopped roaring and snarling. Clearly the man-eater now meant business. Whatever the ogre was doing at that moment, or intended to do next, was to be done in silence. Stanley, already handicapped with only a shotgun, was going to be still further handicapped by not knowing from which direction the man-eater would attack him. This thought worried me. It was hard to sit idly behind a bush while my friend's life might be at that moment in great danger. Without weighing the consequences, I decided to creep after the tiger. No greater folly could have been committed than by my action at that moment, and I will tell you why. Try to imagine the doctor stepping backward, a foot at a time, with his shotgun loaded in both barrels ready for instant use, pointed towards where he thinks the tiger is, creeping upon him unseen and in silence. He does not know that I have left my shelter in the bush and am following him and the tiger. Then put yourself in the tiger's place. Your composure now regained after any exhibition of bad temper, you move softly and silently, bent upon putting an end to this interfering human being who has dared to follow you. At the same time, you are aware that you are close enough for a final spring, but instinct warns you that to do so will court disaster, and you do not know that a second human being is following you. Behind them both am I, creeping forward with equally great caution, my Winchester cocked and ready for use at the first glimpse of the tiger. But I cannot see it, nor Stanley. All I can hear is the faint rustle of a bush here and there before me, as either Stanley or the tiger brushes against it, despite their caution. Finally, do not forget that the distance between the doctor and myself cannot be more than 40 or 50 yards now, with the tiger somewhere in between. If only the tiger had had a little reasoning power, what fun it could have had that day. All it had to do was conceal itself, and then mimic the sound of a charging tiger by roaring. Stanley and I would have opened fire. One or the other would have shot his companion. Perhaps with a spot of luck, or bad luck, we might have shot each other. I would have made more tender eating in those days than now. So would the doctor, even if he smelled faintly of iodoform. And what headlines for the newspapers! Shikaris after man-eater shoot each other. Man-eater eats both. So intent was I on following the tiger that all this did not dawn upon me at the time. The man-eater, unaware of being followed, kept steadfastly after Stanley, while the doctor, naturally worried by the silence that had succeeded the tiger's threatening roars, except for a faint and furtive rustling now and again as the tiger came after him, was wondering if he would reach the track to the huts before the attack came. Then things happened. The doctor reached the track. The tiger broke the silence with a shattering roar. Seeing nothing but hearing everything, I did not know right away whether the man-eater was launching its attack upon the doctor or myself. The doctor fired. The slugs from his gun spattered through the undergrowth, uncomfortably close to me. The tiger, frightened by the sound, lost its nerve, turned and dashed past me at full gallop. I saw the tiger coming, threw the rifle to my shoulder, and pressed the trigger at almost point-blank range. Stanley told me a few minutes later that my bullet whizzed past his head within inches. The only thing that kept it from parting his hair, he affirmed, was that he was bald. Inadvertently, the ogre had almost succeeded in accomplishing what it had been unable to do by the power of reasoning. The doctor and I had narrowly escaped shooting each other. We still had hopes, however. We both had considerable hunting experience. Both had been ready to fire when we had actually pressed our triggers. Both had fired at point-blank range. The tiger must have been laying mortally wounded close by. Perhaps it was even dead. One of us must have wounded it at least. In the excitement, we overlooked the fact that I had heard the slugs from Stanley's gun, while he had heard my bullet. So we searched far and wide, but not a speck of blood did we come across. Of dead or wounded tiger there was neither sight nor sound. Then it dawned upon us, hard though as it was to admit, the truth stuck out a mile. We had both missed. Although the ogre had met us almost face to face, Stanley looked woebegone, and I do not know what I looked like, but I know what I felt like. We made our way in silence back to the huts, where to the man and the two women still hiding there, we confided all that had happened. We were half a furlong from Takarli before my mind, numbed with disappointment, started to function again. Normally, a tiger, after being fired upon, avoids the place where it had happened for a long time. This tiger, it should be remembered, had been fired upon not once, but twice. Therefore, by all the rules, it should leave the neighborhood and not appear there again. But was there just a small chance to the contrary? The ogre had already shown itself to be one of a most unusual disposition on 2 occasions. It fled, then turned and crept back again, and it had deliberately followed Stanley when the way was clear to return to its kill. Would it once again display its singular nature by returning to the place where, at least instinct must tell it, it had suffered 2 narrow escapes? The chances were 99% against. That left a 1% chance that the tiger might return. I halted in my tracks as the thought came to me. The doctor stopped also, wondering what was the matter. I told him. Stanley frowned and puckered his forehead in thought, then shook his head. But he was too much of a hunter himself not to realize the chance was one that must not be missed. So we retraced our steps to the huts. The man and the 2 women, now locked together in one of the huts for mutual safety, were surprised at our early return. When we told them why we had come, they were really pleased. But they were honest enough to say they did not think we would have any chance of success. It was the man's opinion that the tiger would be many miles away by now. Stanley and I retraced our steps to the place where the remains of the man-eater's victim lay strewed about, exercising extreme caution while negotiating the patch of jungle through which the doctor, the tiger, and I had played our strange game of hide-and-seek. There was neither sight nor sound of our quarry. A strange mixture of relief and disappointment filled us. Relief that the ogre had not launched another attack, and disappointment at the feeling that it might never return. My earlier survey of the possibilities of concealment, although made in such a hurry, had about summed up the chances accurately. Apart from the 4-foot-high bush where I had stood while the doctor retreated, there was no other place in which I could conceal myself. Hiding behind that bush in daylight for the man-eater, as I had done already, was one thing, but remaining there after darkness was quite another. The tiger, with its ability to see at night, would spot me immediately as it approached what was left of its victim from any angle other than directly opposite the bush behind which I would be hiding, while for me to see would be impossible. Further, should it indeed return in spite of being shot at twice only a few hours earlier, the man-eater would undoubtedly make an extremely cautious approach, and I would not be able to hear it. Lastly, there was no possibility of erecting any sort of shelter behind that scanty bush that would not immediately betray my presence. What could I do? I was reluctant to forego that tiny possibility of the man-eater's return. To commit suicide, and that too in a most painful manner in the jaws of a tiger, I was still more reluctant. There seemed no solution as we thought about the matter without speaking, till suddenly the doctor had a brainwave. Would it not be possible, with the help of the man and the 2 women in the nearby huts, to dig a narrow hole just where the human remains were scattered? He would hide in the hole, which would be wide and deep enough to conceal him, wait until the tiger returned, and shoot it at point-blank range. Several obstacles to the execution of this plan presented themselves. Firstly, the tiger might discover the hole and shy away. Worse still, the tiger might decide to investigate it. Secondly, admitting that the man in the hole was hidden from the tiger was equally hidden from the man in the hole, who would necessarily have to stand erect to be able to shoot the beast, during which process the latter would surely spot him when he appeared, as it would seem, out of the very ground. When that happened, the tiger would be frightened, yes, but it would also be decidedly annoyed. What transpired after that would depend upon which of the aforementioned reflexes gained the upper hand. Well, there was no use thinking further about it. The chance and the risk would have to be taken, or the whole plan dropped. Time was passing, and it was now after 3 p.m. We would have to work fast. We hurried back to the huts, where the inmates gladly offered to help us, but stated that they had no implements of any sort to dig with. The doctor, who in his capacity of village medico wielded much influence, solved this by returning to Takarthi at the double, from whence he came back in an incredibly short time with 6 helpers, with 2 pickaxes, 2 with crowbars, and 2 with large baskets in which to remove all traces of the earth we dug out. With the 3 earlier helpers and ourselves, the 11 of us set to work, with the result that, astonishingly soon, the hole had been dug and all traces of loose earth removed and thrown far away. I knew that as the father of the plan, Stanley prepared the hole to sit in it himself. I also knew that no amount of persuasion would dissuade him. If I tried to tell him that his shotgun was not an effective weapon against so dangerous a quarry, he would reply that it was just the right thing at such close range, nor would I be able to gainsay the truth of his assertions, as, in reality, at point-blank range a 12-bore gun has its merits. So I resigned myself to inactivity for once by spending the night at Takarthi. Our helpers were just gathering their tools together prior to departing with me, when Dame Fortune once again took a hand in this strange adventure. 2 men burst upon us, having run all the way from Takarthi in search of the doctor. One was the village patel, quite a young man for such a responsible post, the other his servant. The patel announced that his wife, who was heavily pregnant, had slipped and fallen while carrying her pot of water from the well. She had aborted and was bleeding profusely. The doctor must come at once. While he was still speaking, the young man summed up the position and realized that Stanley was preparing to set up for the tiger. So to make his summons more forceful, he started lamenting aloud that the doctor and his friend must come to his aid at once to save his wife's life, while in the same breath he denounced the woman as a stubborn wench. How often had he told her not to carry weights, particularly the water pot from the well? Was he not the village patel? Did he not have servants enough for this task? Yet in her wilfulness, she would never listen to him. Now this was the result. And never mind the tiger, was his wife's life not far more important? Stanley looked at me, chagrin written large upon his face. Then he gripped my arm tightly, affectionately. "Good luck, Andy," he muttered, "and be careful, please. Would you like to use my gun?" "Thanks, Doc," I replied. "You know how it is. Old Winnie will do the trick." In another minute, Stanley and the other members of the group, which had grown to 12, were lost to sight. I was alone, with the remains of the dead man. Dusk was fast approaching, and there was not a moment to be lost as I slipped into the hole we had prepared, to squat at the bottom and look upwards at the circle of the sky above my head. By canting my Winchester, loaded and cocked, at an angle with the butt against my right thigh, and the foresight guard leaning against the wall of the hold opposite me, we had made sure, by means of measuring Stanley's 12-bore gun in juxtaposition, that the end of the muzzle would not be visible above ground level. In the excitement and hurry of forming and executing what I now began to realize was a rather insane plan, we had overlooked the fact that it would be terribly hot inside the hole. The earth around had been exposed to the sun's rays all day, no air could enter, and with my body in close proximity to the sides of the cavity, air could not circulate anywhere. I soon began to perspire profusely. Fortunately, in those days, there were no wild elephants around Takarthi, or for that matter, in any of the districts to the northwest of Mysore State. Those were the times when tigers roamed in hundreds. But things have now changed, and carnivora are scarce. But Jumbo and all his wild state has extended his wanderings into those jungles, and herds of elephants have now made their home there, where once there were none. I remember that it was almost deathly silent inside the hole, and I could scarcely hear the roosting calls of peafowl, jungle cocks, and other birds as they settled down for the night. To hope to hear the man-eater's arrival by any faint sound that it might make was out of the question, but I would only be able to hear it if it roared or snarled nearby, and the ogre was hardly likely to do that. Or so at least I thought, till I recollected that the tiger had in fact done just that only a few hours earlier. How I hoped it would repeat its performance, rather than decide upon a silent approach. It was almost dark when the circle of sky above my head was crossed by an elongated black form that passed silently by. A nightjar, with wings outstretched, had flown low over the spot, evidently to investigate the possibility of devouring the insects that were already assembling to feed upon the exposed flesh that hung in shreds from the human bones and devoured portions of the carcass of the tiger's unfortunate victim. I could hear the blue bottles as they buzzed across the opening above my head to settle on the mess, while the stench of decaying flesh, increased by the sun's rays in which it had been baking all day, seemed to cling to the ground and flow into the hole as an invisible, nauseating liquid. Would the tiger come? Would it start eating right away? Or would it know that something unusual was afoot? It might have been watching us from the cover of some distant bush. It might even know, at that very moment, that one of its hated foes, a man, had gone into hiding somewhere in the ground. Now would be an excellent opportunity for the tiger to unearth and devour that enemy. The thought was not a very bracing one. Where there had been an oval of sky above, 2 stars now twinkled down upon me, and I knew that night had fallen. They seemed so serene and peaceful up there, oblivious to my predicament down in the hole. My thoughts focused upon them, and I wondered at what other tragedies, taking place at that moment in other remote corners of the earth, they had also twinkled upon so impartially. The next moment the 2 stars seemed to be endowed with a baleful significance. They turned into 2 cruel eyes that glowered down upon me in hostile anticipation. Of what? I forced myself to cast off this depressing idea and to think of something else. It is amazing what strange and often irrelevant thoughts come to one's head when in danger, as I was then. Perhaps this is nature's way of providing protection from panic. I wondered if Stanley would be able to save the life of the Patel's wife. That was when I first heard the sound. Faint but distinctly heavy breathing. It must be the tiger. It had located me and was creeping upon its stomach to get close enough to pull me out of my hiding place. Involuntarily, my hand reached toward the rifle. The touch of metal and wood, warm like everything else in that wretched pit, was very comforting to my nerves. The sound ceased for a while. Then I heard a sudden loud hiss, followed by silence again. Could this be a passing panther? I have already mentioned that panthers were scarce in this area, as the tigers had driven them out simply by devouring them. Nevertheless, there were 1 or 2 to be found here and there, and it was possible that the odd member had happened to be passing and stumbled upon the exposed kill, creeping forward to snatch a mouthful. The heavy breathing and the hissing sound could certainly have been made by a panther, bent upon stealing the tiger's kill. I did not hear anything more for quite a long time. Then came a dull, scraping sound, as of something gliding over the ground above my head. Could a large snake be the cause? A hamadryad? There were quite a number of them to be found in these forests, where the vegetation and jungles were of the wet variety, unlike the forests further south. Silence followed, while I strained my ears to pick up the faintest of sounds, and my eyes stared upward at the faint light of the hole above me till they ached. The 2 stars still twinkled down upon me, but whether in disdain or mockery, I did not know. I saw that they had shifted further toward the edge of the circle above me, and would soon disappear from view, indicating that time had passed since I had first observed them. I would miss their company, and then would really be alone. Would their place be taken by other stars, I wondered? This thought was still in my mind, when at last the heavy silence was broken. There was a loud crack, and the man-eater began to gnaw the bone it had just broken. The noise made by a feeding tiger indicates its mood. Generally, it is one of great contentment, and the sounds of mastication, gnawing, chewing, and the tearing and rending of flesh follow one another as the feast progresses. Should there be a second tiger present, or the killer be a tigress with cubs, there is a lot of growling and wrangling, accompanied by threatening snarls when the other tiger, or a cub, approaches too closely. For despite the ties of motherly love, which are considerable, and instances have been known where a tigress has sacrificed her life for her cubs, when it comes to eating, instinct seems to tell the feasting tigress that food is something not to be shared too soon, and to urge her to eat her fill before allowing her companion, mate, or even her cubs to approach and eat what may be left. The tiger above me began to growl. I knew then that it could not be alone. Perhaps there were cubs? Perhaps another tiger accompanying the man-eater? The situation was decidedly complicated and more than what I had bargained for. None of us had considered this possibility earlier in the evening, when this setting in the whole idea had occurred to Stanley. I thought hard what to do next. Obviously, in order to take a shot at the tiger, I would have to locate it first by peeping over the edge of the hole, and then by drawing the rifle right out of the hole and placing it on the ground outside so as to take aim. All this would entail considerable movement. I might even make a sound of some sort. The rifle might knock against the ground. The feeding animal would hear me and attack before I could fire my weapon. There might be a slight hope of escaping the tiger's attention, should he or she happen, luckily, to be facing the other way. But there was a second tiger present. Even cubs could give the game away if they saw my head and shoulders, followed by my rifle emerging from the ground. It was certainly straining imagination and luck too far to hope that all animals above me would have their backs to me and be looking in the wrong direction. And if there should be two tigers above me, which of them was the man-eater? A silly question that. Obviously the one that was eating. But had both developed the man-eating habit, or only one? I must not kill the wrong tiger. Therefore I must shoot both and take no chances. The alternative course of action was to sit in silence in the hole, allow the animals to finish their meal, and afterwards go about their business, then call it a day. But I had come here to shoot a man-eater, not to hide from it. I thought of the man it had killed and was now eating. What would Stanley and the villagers say of me when they came in the morning to find the ground covered with tiger pug marks and scraps of the man otherwise completely devoured, and me hiding in the hole? Well, here goes, I said to myself. And a millimeter at a time, if such slow movement can in truth be possible, I began to position my feet so as to support me. Then slowly, very, very slowly, I started to raise myself, to bring my head to ground level. This in itself took a long time, for I had to avoid making the slightest sound, and my thighs and legs were cramped from squatting so long on my haunches. The tiger continued feeding, growling and snarling now and again to keep the other tiger, or perhaps the cubs, away. At last I was on my knees and toes, and I stretched my two hands downward to help support my weight on my outstretched fingers. Then very slowly I began to raise myself. Time had passed and the strain on my hands and legs began to tell, but I must not hurry. Even now, as my ears came closer to the surface above, the tiger's growls grew stronger. I began to be frightened. My hands were beginning to tremble with the sustained strain of supporting my weight when I sensed that the top of my head must have reached above ground level. I could not delay longer, for the tiger, or tigers, would be able to see me, should they be looking in my direction, whilst I would not be able to see them. I therefore quickly raised my head until my eyes were level with the earth. A terrifying sight confronted me. Luckily, through sitting in the darkness of the hole for so long, my eyes had grown accustomed to the gloom so that I could see, only a few feet away, lying broadside on, the enormous form of a tiger extended on its belly, chewing some part of the victim which it was holding between its front paws. Worse still, there was another form, also at full stretch, slightly further away from me and a few feet from the feasting tiger, but facing it and watching anxiously as the latter swallowed mouthful after mouthful. This second tiger, facing the first, was also facing me, and could not fail to see the top of my head popping out of the earth. It let out a snarl of surprise and scrambled to its feet. I ducked into my hole like a jack-in-the-box, grabbed my rifle and looked upwards, expecting to find one or both tigers attacking the opening, or to raise myself and the rifle quickly to ground level and risk a shot. But I remembered there were 2 tigers, not one, outside. So I funked it and decided to set tight. All this occupied only a few seconds, but in that time the feasting tiger had not been idle. Hearing its companion snarl and seeing it spring to its feet, this animal, not knowing that the sight of me was the cause of the excitement, concluded that its companion had decided to fight for a share of the kill. There was a second loud roar, followed by a fearful din, as the feaster, who obviously was the man-eater, attacked the tiger that had spotted me. Now is my chance, I said to myself, for their attention was so distracted that they would not notice me. I quickly raised myself, first the rifle, then head and shoulders reached ground level. For a moment I could see nothing, and do nothing because of the dust that was raised by the fighting animals, but neither tiger was anyway in sight, nor was there any growling or snarling to be heard. I could not understand it. Perhaps the second tiger had fled with the first in pursuit? But if that was so, I should have heard some sounds at least, snarls and growls as one animal chased the other away. Perhaps they saw the rifle, or even the top of my head emerging from the hole, and fled at such an unexpected apparition. Then, too, there should have been growling and snarling, at least some sounds of departure. As it was, the jungle was silent. I could not fathom it. It was eerie. The thought then occurred to me that if the man-eater had chased its companion away, it would undoubtedly return to finish what was left of the kill. So I ducked back into the hole to await its return and the renewed sounds of eating. I waited in vain. Maybe half an hour had passed when I heard a loud, sustained human scream. It shattered the silence, rose to a crescendo, and then faded into choking sobs, and was still. Then I heard other yells and shouts, and could make out a deeper voice and a more shrill one. Those were the voices of the man and one of the 2 women from the 2 huts not far away. They were screaming for help. That was when I grasped what had happened. The second woman had been taken by the man-eater, and chasing its companion away from the feast, or perhaps in its headlong flight after seeing my rifle and myself appear out of the ground, the man-eater must have passed the 2 huts where the man and his wife and the widow of the late victim were sheltering. But how did the ogre get to its second victim? Perhaps it was in such a towering rage that it just dragged her out of the hut in which she was sleeping. This tiger certainly was not hungry enough to justify such an action, as it had been feasting all this while. I wondered what to do. Should I remain where I was, or hasten to the huts? In either event, there was not much that I could do. There was little chance that the man-eater would return to the bones of its first victim when it had a fresh one at its disposal, and I would not be able to follow it up with a second kill because of the darkness. That could only be done after daybreak. I decided to remain where I was. It was just possible that the second tiger, the one that had been chased away, might return to the scant remains laying above me. If it did so, I would shoot. Even if it were not the ogre itself, this second tiger would undoubtedly become a man-eater in time. I remembered how, a short while ago, it lay anxiously awaiting for a chance to eat the human remains, though held at bay by the feasting man-eater. I spent a sleepless night after that, uncomfortably hot and stung by tiny ants and other insects that had decided to share my shelter. Nothing came, and no sound disturbed the silence till about 4 o'clock. Then a hyena discovered the bones above me, and a great commotion began. The hyena smelled the tigers and knew it was about to commit an unpardonable crime of robbery. It also knew that to be caught by the owner or owners would mean death. It was undecided, therefore, between satisfying its hunger and its fear of being killed, and in this state of indecision made a great noise, letting the whole jungle know that it was faced with a tremendous dilemma. I could hear the creature running rapidly round and round, uttering weird sounds of every conceivable dilemma. It chattered, then growled like faraway thunder. Then it decided to be mournful about the whole business. It pleaded piteously, like a cat begging for food. But the problem remained unsolved. The tiger did not show itself, but might come at any moment, and that would be the hyena's last if it lingered. All this amused me and served to distract my thoughts from the fearful tragedy that must have been enacted so close to me while I was powerless to intervene. The opening above me grew a little brighter with the coming of the false dawn before the hyena, who had remained noisily persistent all this time, finally summoned up enough courage to start eating. I heard the crunch of a few bones for a short while, then fear must have returned to its craven heart, for I heard the pattering sound of its departure. I could picture the poor beast slinking quickly away, a human bone between its jaws, for gnawing later in the safety of its shelter among the rocks or in a hole in the ground, far from this place of danger and lurking death. I awaited the advent of the true dawn before raising the Winchester and myself very cautiously above ground level. The coast was clear, and I dragged my cramped legs out of that awful hole, stamped about for a few minutes to restore the circulation, then set off to the huts to see what had happened. There I came upon a dreadful sight. The terrified man and his wife, still hiding in the corner of one of the huts, told me a very harrowing tale. Along with the widow of the man-eater's victim, they had decided to sleep in one of the huts, the one they felt was more secure of the two. The man had taken good care to sleep in the center of the floor, equidistant from all the walls, while his wife had slept to the left of him. The second woman had been forced to sleep somewhere by herself, so she laid down a little distance away. Naturally, she must have felt a little nervous, but as modesty forbade her to lie down to the right of the man, she had been compelled to sleep as far away as possible from the couple. So she lay down near the wall of the hut, and opposite their feet. The hut was comparatively small. It was roughly a square, about 12 feet by 12, allowing 6 feet for the man and his wife, who were sleeping in the center of the hut, and another 3 feet in order to be clear of their legs. The second woman was therefore lying at the most, not more than a yard from the wall. The foot of the walls of such huts, in damper parts of India, are kept a few inches from the ground, so that the termites cannot climb them overnight and destroy a large part of the structure by daylight. This practice leaves a slight opening around all four sides at ground level. The man-eater, who had passed very close to the hut, either in pursuit of its companion or in flight from me, was probably in a great rage. It must have caught a glimpse of the sleeping woman or sensed her presence through the small opening, and had decided to drag her out. It had inserted one of its paws under the opening, grabbed the woman, and had begun to pull her out. Her screams and wails, which I had heard, had awakened her two companions, who in turn started to yell and call for help. Meanwhile, the man-eater had succeeded in dragging the woman's head and neck outside the hut, and had killed her by tearing out her gullet, but the rest of the body was stuck inside, for in dying the woman clung to two of the bamboos supporting the wall of the hut. These had broken, and the end of one of them, piercing her saree and jacket, had gone right into the flesh of her side, thus wedging her body against the bamboo wall. The pandemonium caused by her wails and the shouts of her companions seemed to have acted as a deterrent. The tiger changed his mind and abandoned the victim. The carcass of the woman as it lay before me was a dreadful sight. The tiger's claws had pierced the chest and torn one breast to ribbons. Then the ogre had bitten right through her gullet and had wrenched out her windpipe, leaving the bones of her neck and the skin behind to keep her head from being totally severed. She lay in a pool of her own blood, most of which had soaked into the dry earth, except for some that had coagulated here and there. The two survivors, man and wife, crouched wide-eyed and paralyzed with fear in the far corner of the hut, expecting the man-eater to return at any moment. In fact, they were so terrified as to be oblivious of the fact that it was already daylight outside. Hearing my approaching footsteps, and thinking they heard the tiger returning, they started to gibber in fear. I called aloud to reassure them. The man and the woman then hurled themselves at the door of the hut, opened it, and rushed outside, to fall on the ground, trembling and crying in terror and relief at the same time. They were quite hysterical, and took a long while to calm down enough to tell their story. I had entered the hut and was reviewing the dreadful sight inside when Stanley and some of the men who had helped us the previous evening arrived upon the scene. Stanley had been awake all night but had not heard any report from my rifle, the sound of which would have carried to Takarthi village. He therefore concluded that the tiger had not returned, or that I had been killed, and was hurrying to find out what had happened. I fear my first question took the good doctor aback. "How is the Patel's wife?" He looked rather pained at my irrelevance, then muttered, "She's safe, but what has happened?" I told the story. Our plans were soon laid. We bundled the two survivors and their belongings out of the hut, an action that did not require much persuasion, and advised them to return, with the rest of our party, to the village. Stanley would hide in their hut while I would conceal myself in the one with the corpse of the slayed woman. Ordinarily, the man-eater might be expected to return to its kill, but as there was a second tiger, which was potentially a man-eater, if not already one, the doctor would be available to deal with it. We laid our plans carefully. To begin with, neither of us would fire in the direction where the other was hiding. Secondly, should Stanley see one of the tigers, or both of them first, he was to hold his fire till the actual man-eater approached the carcass of its victim, in order to give me the chance of a shot at the real culprit. As soon as I had fired, the doctor was to shoot the second tiger if it was still within sight. These precautions were necessary to avoid a mistake at the last moment, for should the doctor fire first, he might shoot the wrong tiger, and the man-eater would escape. We had to account for the ogre primarily, although for reasons I've already given, the second tiger had to be shot too. But the man-eater must die first, and we could not risk its escape. As I was tired after a sleepless night, while Stanley was less so, even though he had spent a good part of the night attending to the Patel's wife, it was agreed that I should go back to Takarthi for a meal and some sleep, returning by 3 o'clock, bringing the doctor's lunch and some food for both of us to eat later on, besides drinking water, tea, and the torch that Stanley fitted to the barrels of his shotgun. It was wise that one of us should remain on guard, just in case either of the tigers took the unusual step of returning to kill by day. Another idea then occurred to me. I told Stanley, and he agreed to it. We took a gunny sack from one of the huts and walked down to the remains of the earlier kill. My plan was to remove all that was left of it, so that, should either of the tigers, or both of them, think of revisiting the old spot, they would find nothing. That would urge them to come to the huts, where we would be hiding. A slight hitch arose when we asked our men to do this job. Being of high caste, they recoiled with horror and flatly refused. There was nothing but for Stanley and myself to do the job ourselves. Stanley did not mind, for he was a doctor, but it was an unpleasant undertaking for me. What little remained of the meat was 2 days old and stunk abominably. Further, bluebottles had laid their eggs in the remains, and in the hot sun maggots had already hatched in myriads. The flesh was covered in a seething mass of them. We gathered all the bits and pieces and put them into the sack. Since none of our followers would touch it, I had the unhappy task of conveying this nasty burden on my shoulder all the way to the village. It was surprising how heavy those bits and pieces turned out to be, although they represented so very little of their owner. I smelled dreadfully and was in a bath of perspiration. Some sticky fluid had oozed through the sacking from the putrefying flesh and bones within. It was on my hands, shoulders, and neck when I dumped my grisly burden at the entrance to the local police. The constable on sentry gazed at me goggle-eyed. For once in his life, he was too taken aback to ask for a statement. I remembered about the statement well enough, but did not care to remind him. There was going to be a hell of a row in any case, when the sub-inspector and the other busybodies from headquarters arrived at Takarthi. Why had we removed the remains from the scene of the tragedy? How were the police to know that the man had been killed by a tiger? He might have been murdered. Perhaps he committed suicide. What I wanted was a bath, tea, and plenty of it, a hot meal, and some sleep. I hastened to the little quarters occupied by the doctor, which he had invited me to share with him, and yelled to his servant boy to prepare a gallon of tea. Then I divested myself of my stinking clothes and washed my shirt. Next I had a bath, and what a bath! Emerging at least 2 pounds lighter in weight, I set about the tea and had consumed maybe 2 quarts when the doctor's servant seriously suggested I leave some room for lunch, but there was no lunch left when I stood up from the table. I observed the servant had conceived a new respect for me as a glutton of great capacity. I told the boy to put the doctor's lunch aside and to make dinner for both of us, saying that I would take the 3 meals with me to the 2 huts at 3 o'clock. In sadness, the youngster shook his head and replied aggrievedly that there was no lunch left. I had eaten it all. So I gave him money to make some lunch, also the 2 dinners, and I told him to awaken me at 2:30 sharp. When he awakened me, it was nearly 3 o'clock, but as the meals were ready and packed together with 2 flasks of tea and 2 canteens of water, I had only to pick up the doctor's torch and place it in a large bag with the food and flasks, sling the canteens and my rifle over my shoulders, and set out for the huts. Walking fast, I soon arrived to find a very hungry doctor who had no news of the tigers. He swallowed his lunch while we reviewed our plans in whispers and drank some water. The flasks of tea we decided to keep for the night. At 4 o'clock, we separated. I went to the neighboring hut where the woman's body lay, taking my rifle, torch, dinner, and a flask of tea with a half a canteen of water, leaving Stanley in the other hut with his share of the tea, water, and food. Taking up my position at the further end, as far away as possible from the spot where the corpse was laying half in and half out of the little structure, I made myself comfortable in preparation for the long vigil of 14 hours till dawn. I have cultivated the habit of sitting cross-legged for hours on end, practically motionless and without sound, a habit essential if you ever have to sit up for game. The slightest movement or faintest sound will betray your presence to any wild creature, animal or bird. If your quarry is an animal possessed of a keen sense of smell, the direction in which the prevailing breeze happens to be blowing also has to be taken into account. And the stronger the breeze, the further your scent is carried. For this reason, poachers of deer in India seldom go out on a windy night. Falling rain prevents the scent being carried far, but equally so all animals, except tigers, take shelter from the elements, and if the rain is really bad, even tigers and elephants restrict their movements. Now, as tigers only have a very poor sense of smell, that factor did not trouble me. What I did have to be careful about was that the man-eater should not discover my presence by sight or sound. After the adventure of the previous night, and the scare it had received, we could expect both tigers to be very cautious. It is remarkable how instinct enables a man-eater to differentiate between a possible victim, helpless and defenseless, and a would-be hunter capable of taking its life. Having been sheltered from the sun, the corpse was not smelling yet, and it was otherwise pleasant inside the hut, offering a great relief from the conditions of the previous night and the hot and tight-fitting hole. Everything about me was quiet, for in fear of the man-eater, the herdsmen of Takarthi and the neighboring villages for miles around had abandoned their usual habit of driving their herds out to the jungles to graze. The afternoon passed in silence except for the buzzing of flies that had discovered the dead body and were busy laying their eggs in the raw flesh. The darkness of the evening was accentuated within the hut, and it soon became difficult to see, although I could perceive the lingering daylight outside, visible right around me through the few inches of space between the base of the walls of the hut and the floor. Because of the scarcity of panthers and the larger species of wildcats, jungle fowl, which are normally prey of these animals, swarmed in this area, and their calls, together with those of spurfowl and peafowl, told me the sun was about to set. Silently I munched the food I had brought with me for dinner, and drank some tea. In due course the cries of the birds died away, to be replaced by the calls of a nearby herd of spotted deer, and the belling of a more distant sambar stag. This told me that the sun had set, although by now it was already quite dark inside the hut where I was sitting. Soon the nightjars began their teasing cries, and a night heron wailed in the little stream at the bottom of the valley. Then I knew that night had fallen indeed, and I could now see nothing in the interior of that hut. If the man-eater came and started to remove the cadaver of the woman, I would be compelled to use my torch. This raised a problem. When I used the torch, its beam would necessarily strike against the inside of the wall of the hut and be reflected back into my eyes. I would not be able to see beyond, or to look through the gap between the wall and the floor. In other words, the man-eater would not be visible to me. The thought began to trouble me, and I decided to change my position. I would lie prone on the floor, close as possible to that part of the woman's body which remained inside. This would give me a great advantage. By keeping my rifle extended on the ground before me, all I would need to do, when the tiger came, would be to point the barrel in the animal's direction and press the trigger. The man-eater could not avoid making some noise when it began to pull the woman's carcass out of the hut, for, as you will remember, in the struggle of the previous night, the end of one of the bamboos of the hut wall became embedded in her flesh. The tiger would have to tear the body free from this obstruction. Gathering the flask of tea and my weapon, I crept quietly across the floor till I reached the woman's body. Then I lay down beside it, the rifle on the ground before me with the butt under my armpit and the end of the barrel only a few inches from the opening. Accidentally, my shoulder touched something that was cold and hard and very stiff. It was the corpse's leg, and I drew a few inches away. 3 hours passed with no sign of any tiger. It was well after 10 o'clock. Tigers generally return to their kills around 8, panthers very much earlier. And I was beginning to think our quarries had decided to keep clear of the huts, when the leg which had touched my shoulder 3 hours ago touched it again. What was far worse, that cold, stiff leg was now moving very distinctly. It was not only rubbing against my shoulder now, but moving gently forwards. Not a sound could I hear, but the leg moved again. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Panic seized me. I was on the verge of scrambling to my hands and knees and getting as far as possible away from that awful, mangled human thing that had come to life. Then reason returned. I could feel myself trembling and the perspiration was pouring down my face as I discovered the solution. The leg and its owner had not come back to life, nor did it move on its own volition. The man-eater was moving it. I could see nothing. There was no sense in sticking the barrel of my rifle forward and firing blindly. That would only scare the tiger away to continue its depredations elsewhere. At the most, I might wound it. I had first to make certain what I was firing at. Then, it was that I heard a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere very close to me, no little to my right. I could still see nothing. I was tempted to switch on my torch, but I remembered in time that to do so might result in dazzling myself. Yet it was imperative that I should find out where this scratching sound came from, and what was causing it. I did an extremely stupid thing. Not being able to see, I thought I might be able to feel what was going on. And with this in mind, I stretched my right arm very slowly forwards in the direction of the scratching. I did not have far to reach. My questioning fingertips contacted something hairy, something sinewy, and the next instant all hell was let loose. The man-eater, perhaps remembering its difficulty of the night before to free the body of its victim, or maybe in an endeavor to secure a better grip on the corpse, had extended its paw into the gap below the wall and was groping for a hold on something solid. That movement of its paw was the cause of the scratching sound I had heard a moment before. When my fingertips touched its skin, not having heard of ghosts, the tiger knew there was something alive inside the hut. An ordinary tiger would have bolted, but the ogre, who was no ordinary tiger, and had always done the unexpected, lost its temper. It let out a terrific roar, then grasped the wall of the hut in its jaws and began to tear it apart. My task after that was easy. A great hole appeared before me, and the beam of my torch revealed a horrifying tiger with the manning of the wall still stuffed in its mouth. With only a few inches to find its target, the bullet of my 405 entered high into the throat. Then I rolled over and over with my rifle to get out of range of what I knew would follow. I was near the far end of the hut when the ogre hurled itself through the gap, but I had time to put 2 more shots straight into its head. With the dying animal thrashing about on the floor, I rushed to the door of the hut, flung it open, and leaped out, only to be confronted by yet another terrifying spectacle. Another tiger was there, about 20 feet away, into one end of the further hut. But it was laying on the ground, stretched on its side and still twitching. Stanley had killed the second tiger, almost at point-blank range, with lethal balls fired simultaneously from both barrels of his shotgun. Because of the noise made by my own rifle, and because of my own excitement, I had entirely failed to hear Stanley's shots. The doctor related afterwards that he had heard the man-eater's roar, followed by the report of my first shot, then the sounds of the hut wall being demolished. Disregarding our agreement, he had dashed out to my aid, to be confronted by the sight of the second tiger, standing broadside onto him, a few yards away, watching its mate, and obviously undecided what to do. He had fired both barrels of his shotgun, loaded with lethal balls, into the animal's heart, killing it instantly. As we suspected, the man-eater turned out to be a tigress, the other animal her mate. There was much tom-tomming and rejoicing at Takarthi until dawn, and when the news reached Bellundur the next day, old Bediah strutted about, filled with pride. Was he not the greatest of all magicians? Had not his mantras brought about the doom of the man-eater and also her mate? Bediah was happy indeed. With his fame as a necromancer soaring once again, he could look forward to many feasts of cock curry and many more bottles of that fire arrack for which the villagers of Bellundur were famed. He was dead drunk by midday when I called to thank him.
Thank you so much for watching my video. I really hope you liked the story. I really enjoyed putting this whole video together from start to finish. These videos take a really long time, from writing my script to reading the stories and designing my own art for the video. I think it's important for me as a creator to make my own illustrations and write my own scripts and stay away as much as possible from the rampant use of AI these days. So I really hope this story was enjoyable for you to listen to and visually fun to follow along. I can't wait to start the next video and see what that happens to be. There's a lot of ideas I have, so I can't thank everybody enough for following along. The reception from my first video blew me away, and many of you who have followed and subscribed here, just you don't know how happy that makes me. So thank you for being here, and I'm excited to keep exploring stories that I want to tell with art that I've made and tell it the way I only know to tell it. Thank you. I'll see you in the next one.